thank you so much for joining us. Before the discussion starts, I'll just be introducing Professor Chaudhuri. So Professor Amit Chaudhuri is the author of 8 novels. He's also a poet, critic, essayist, short story writer and musician. His 4th book of poems, Sweet Shop, New and Selected Poems, was published in 2023 in the New York Review Books Poet Series. Paper released the full set of the fiction he has published in the last 30 years over 2022 and 2023 in the UK. His first 3 novels are to be published in the New York Review Books Classics imprint during May of this year. Awards for his fiction and non-fiction include the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the James Tate Black Prize, the Encore Prize, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, and the Government of India Sahitya Academy Award. You can also buy a copy of the book yourself after the talk, so we have copies of the book for you. And yeah, that's about it. I'll be handing it over to Professor right now, and I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Hi everyone. I wish I could say make yourself comfortable, but I see many of you standing. I don't know how to arrange for more seating, but thank you all for...
Sit here. I mean, it's not grass, of course.
Thank you all for coming. It's lunch hour and our session is called Sweet Shop. Neerja just read out Professor Chaudhuri's bio, and I'd like to begin with the bio since everything seems to emanate from that place. I'd like to begin with your bio, for instance, and for someone who's written about in Odysseus Abroad and in various essays and spoken about your initial ambition to be a poet. Why did it take you so long to put to put the word poet in your bio? I mean, is it easier, for instance, to say, I'm a cricketer, I'm a novelist, I'm a resident of the United States, than it is to say, I'm a poet? I mean, does it have the character of a dreamer and so on? I'd like my students to hear from you about that, because that's a question I'm asked often. When can I say I'm a poet?
Thank you all for coming here. I know it's the prospect of this gulab jamuns that have drawn me. But anyway, the question about bio, my bio, and the word poet missing from it. In fact, I wasn't aware that the poet was missing from it. Indeed, it had been for a very long time. That's true. I didn't think about it. I agonized about the fact that the word musician was missing from it because I took a decision to keep it out of my bio until 2007. So 1991 to 2007, there was no musician in the bio, and now that you mention it, poet, I don't know when I began to mention poet. So I suppose partly because I entered into the world of writing as a published writer, as a novelist. Although I was keen to sort of say, even in my first novel, A Strange and Sublime Address, that it was a novella, that it was a short novel, and the subtitle of the first edition, I think, says a novella and 9 stories. And then later on I changed that into a novel and 9 stories. I thought there was no reason to call it a novella, because I was anyway embarked upon something as a fiction writer that seemed to have no consensus as far as readers were concerned as to whether they were novels or not. So just by calling it a novella, which for me the word had a great history, a personal history and a cultural history, in terms of form, and I recall feeling delighted when I came upon as a reader and a writer who had embarked on a novel, on Henry James's kind of confession to his love for what he called the blessed nouvelle, the short novel. And that became a lifelong preoccupation, the marginalization of the short novel and the shorter forms. That became a lifelong preoccupation for me as to why that happened in the English language. What was it about the English language in particular, as practiced especially in the United Kingdom and in post-1980s India, that marginalized what can only be called the more formalist works, the formalist genres. And I say formalist because, as I've said before, with a novel you can, with a sprawling novel, you can sort of enter the illusion that this is about life. You forget about it as a form. It's a narrative. The narrative is about life. It's almost kind of interchangeable with life. It has its messiness. It has these range of people. It can be read in terms of documentation, society, reality. The moment you encounter a short story or a novella, a short novel, you are aware of the form, you are aware of brevity. That the person has chosen not to say everything. Sorry, I'm not answering the question. So, but I'm just saying that I had trouble with this, with having entered the world of publishing at a time when the novel itself had an ideological makeover. And also cultures such as ours, to put it crassly and loosely, South Asia, India, or the non-West, were at that time, the early 90s, from the late 80s onwards, becoming synonymous with a particular kind of novel. And the so-called rise of those literatures, which at the same time erased whatever modernities had existed before those literatures came into being. So people began to talk about the Indian novel in English as if it was sui generis, it had come out of nowhere, and that nothing existed before it. So I entered into this kind of world at a time when this was happening. So I wanted to keep stuff to myself. I think I felt awkward about this whole business of being a poet, which is something that which was my first love. Poetry was my first love. And then I felt super awkward about being not only a musician, but a Hindustani classical musician. Over there I think I was instinctively eluding the skepticism to do with a world where creativity, and especially in the case of the novel, the role of the novelist had become professionalized. One could identify a novelist by the fact that they produce novels every 2 years. That was the main way that you knew that somebody was a novelist, or this is what they did. To then throw out this challenge in my bio that this is not how it works seemed to me, when I began, premature. I began to then write about these things later, but the change I made to my bio only came out of completely, a response to practical advice. 2005, I began a kind of experiment in music, where I went back to what I never thought I'd go back, that is the blues and the rock and the jazz that I'd grown up with. And I began a project called This Is Not Fusion, and people said, you have to say that you're a musician in your bio. Come on, you need to have a Facebook band account. All kinds of weird things were being thrown in my direction. That's how that period began. So, musician, poet also made its way to my bio around that time, because in the early 2000s I finally had enough for a book of poems called Saint Cyril Book. So I don't know if I should go on any further as to why I finally had enough in the early 2000s for a slim book of poems, after having said that poetry was my first love, whether I should speak about why or pass it on to you.
Maybe we could come back to that
Yeah.
later. You've written about how the spatial, you moved from a 12th story flat in Malabar Hill in Bombay to a second story, is that a second story flat in third story flat in a sensory road in Bangalore. How that kind of directed your poetic voice, your direction to a kind of coming into your own as a poet. In the poetry workshop that I teach with many of my students here, we study a section on how poets write space, and one of the poems we study is Community, which is from the sensory road sequence. And I'd like you to tell them about, and to everyone here, how space, spatiality, and your poetic voice came to be related.
Thank you. So this actually ties up quite well with where I left off. Because I said, I finally had enough material for a book of poems called St. Cyril Road, the place that you mentioned, which came out in the early 2000s, I can't exactly. 2005. It came out then. So, yeah, it ties up. But how does it tie up? Yeah, you asked me questions about space and about the flats I occupy. So the 12th-story flat in Malabar Hill in Bombay, from where my father moved to a 25th-story flat in Cuthbert. I think the transition went like this. So from various domains of silence in Bombay. This is not how it started out in Bombay, because I think when I was very small, my parents lived in a house in Juhu, but I have very few memories of that. So the only experience of being at more or less closer to eye level with the street was during my visits to Calcutta as a child. My annual visits to Calcutta, sometimes twice a year, to my uncle's house as a child, and he lived in an area called Protapaditya Road, which is in Bhawanipur in South Calcutta. And like all of those houses, they were like 2 or 3 stories high. They had a chhat or a terrace, and this terrace was very prized. No two houses are built exactly along the same lines, so it's not like the kind of semi-detached houses you would see in a London street, where every house is identical. They all have common features. The terrace is very prized, and its view onto other terraces. It's not a view onto the Arabian Sea or something equivalent to the Arabian Sea. That's the kind of view that I was getting from my 12th story and 25th story locations, looking out at the Arabian Sea and the Marine Drive as well. So these were super sort of privileged and prized and expensive views. I was quite miserable with those views, and I didn't see them actually. When they were in front of me, I didn't see them, and I was not interested in seeing them. The act of seeing came to me when I was in my uncle's house during those holidays, and I would look across at another balcony or what's happening behind the window of a house opposite. The house opposite was called Ukiler Bari, the house of the lawyer, So we didn't know who the Ukil was, but that was an amazing view as far as we were concerned. And there was no television at that time. I'm talking about the 60s and early 70s. I mean, early 70s, if television had come into mainly programs about agriculture, they gestured towards the new India that were be sort of preoccupied with serious things. But anything commensurate with that view where nothing was happening, and we were wondering what's behind that window, that I would only encounter later in the cinema, let's say, of Marcel Carné, in a certain kind, or in the works of Catherine Mansfield and Joyce and Renoir, the movies of Renoir. So that's where I would encounter that idea that this is interesting. But we found it interesting. So that was my only sort of idea of the physicality of the street. you didn't get that from the 25th story or the 12th story. Then after my father retired, he moved to this place called Saint Cyril, and this was again in 1984 or 85. Saint Cyril Road is in Bandra. If you know Bombay, if you know Bandra, Bandra is a predominantly Christian area. The East Indians and Goans live there, and it had a particular kind of architecture, mainly cottages, low houses, and churches, of course, and schools, and lanes. I remember walking with my parents down those lanes. By that time, by 1983, I'd gone to England. So this was the place I'd come back to. And in 86, I spent a year over there in St. Cyril Road. I took a year, a gap year as they call it, between finishing my first degree and returning a year later to do my DPhil, my PhD. So in these gap years, the fact that it was possible in Bombay to be on eye level with the street, to look out not at the sea but to look out at another house, and the realization that this view of this balcony and that elderly couple opposite me is of greater interest to me than the panoramic views I've seen so far, and then the proximity of life and sound. So in the sense that after my parents moved to that flat, and I arrived in that flat from England, and I was jet lagged, but I was woken up early in the morning by a frightening cacophony, and for a moment I thought, what is this? And then I realized it's bird call. It was at 6 o'clock in the morning. It was bird call. So I had never heard that kind of bird call before. That volume of bird call. What birds do at that time in the morning on that scale. But the area was such. There were so many trees. The buildings were hemmed in and qualified by tree life, that it was possible to begin to register this existence. Now, it had an implication. Am I doing something or not? No. It had an implication on how I lived. Now, I've mentioned the 25th story. I've mentioned the 12th story. I should also mention London, where I was an undergraduate, and I became completely aware of silence, and silence as the law, as it were. That you cannot break the silence, which is being broken here quite well. What is that? Seems unconnected to this. It's like radio static. So I'll continue in the meantime. So I want to sort of mention to you these domains of silence, which then enforce on you an existence which is predominantly mental and psychological. You're not interacting with the world through your senses when you're in a domain that's removed in such a way that you're surrounded by silence and you're more or less alone. When you're more or less alone, then you can have an interior, you can have an interior consciousness, you can have a psychology, you can have a new sense of what it means to, say, read. You read by yourself, you are in communion, or you're in a particular relationship with that book. The moment I was in St. Cyril Road, I could do all of these things, but I was also simultaneously distracted at each moment because the windows were open. Now, the thing about London, for instance, were the closed windows, which meant, being in what was emphatically an interior, sort of emphasize your own interiority and the possibility of your own interiority and the possibility, the grounds on which you are an individual. Now, once the windows are open, you are distracted, and your individuality begins to go. It begins to sort of fray a little bit. And this is what was happening in India. What had happened all along when I would go to my uncle's house, that the individuality would give way to something else, some other form of participating in the world. I didn't realize that, but the years in London, and coming back to St. Cyril Road in 1985, made me realize the importance of this challenge to interiority, challenge to psychology, to the psychological sort of interior. I became liberated by this idea that it is possible to be free of this most oppressive of things, myself, the self. To me, that has been always, since I became a writer, a far deeper source of constriction and anxiety than identity or race or color or anything can ever be. So, however much I may have talked about those things in my work, in essays like about Roads Must Fall in Oxford, or political essays, or novels like Odysseus Abroad, I still believe that the primary source of constriction for the writer is self-consciousness, is consciousness, is this idea of individuality. And the novel plays into this, the realist novel plays into this hugely, because we are told that the novel is about characters, and that characters have an interior life, and that characters have psychology. And for me, all of that was something I wanted to leave behind. So I wanted to leave behind psychology. I wanted to leave behind interiority by the time I was 24 or so. And at that time I was 23, from 23 years old onwards, I had begun to write poems about St. Cyril Road as a way of acknowledging the way the self gives way as you come closer to eye level. The self gives way. You're not an observer, because even the word observer presupposes that you're there observing. You have a kind of posthumous interaction. You're semi-visible. You're not completely there. You're kind of bodiless. You are partaking of the world as the dead wish to, but can't. You're partaking of the world, but not as you would if you were living. That is, that they don't have to apply for a job, but they do want to partake of the world. They do want to look and smell the same things that we do. Those things are a greater reason for them haunting our world than the fact that they wanted a great job. So they're not looking for a job. They want to be in the world. To be in St. Cyril Road was to experience that liberation of being somewhat posthumous, being released from, whatever Amit Chaudhuri wanted to do at that point of time, this person wanted to do, into being not an observer, but somebody who was living in the world without living in it completely, living in the world as the dead mind, that is only partaking of it in a completely sensuous way, such as the dead desire. This led me to think of the novel in a completely different way, as a means of returning to existence. The novel then became a kind of means of satisfying of fulfilling my desire of returning to existence and existing, but as a ghost would, because you can't actually exist in a novel or through novels. But that's the kind of existence I think I stated in A Stranger at Sublime Interest, the envy of the posthumous, because they can live in the world without living in it. This is the context for beginning to first write poems about St. Cyril Road, to acknowledge this shift or towards away from literature, I would say, because I thought literature was about grand themes. I was besotted with modernism. I wanted to write, poems like The Wasteland or some large scale stuff. I needed also a big trauma in my life or in my civilization. So this problem was solved by many writers who came after, who began to publish, not after me, sorry, they came before me. They began to publish novels, let's say, about partition. So the need for the nation or partition as providing something more, something almost metaphysical. Satisfies the idea of what literature should be. Now, the poems in St. Cyril Road were the movement away from literature towards this reconsideration of how one might live life in this way, how one might enter life.
Would you like to read a poem from this collection, the first one?
Sorry?
Would you like to read a poem from the St. Cyril Road collection?
Sure. Well, which one should I read?
My students who are here read Community with me from the St. Cyril Road sequence.
Okay.
So you could read anything. Maybe the Banter Medical Store? Or would you, anything of features?
Bandra Medical Store I won't read because it's one of my greatest hits. Actually not. But I will read what I'll read, which I've never done before. But since you guys are here and it's a special occasion, and this is me being cheesy as I seldom am. It's like my American, what used to be like a Neil Diamond moment. But anyway, since you guys are here, I'll take that as a kind of departure from the way I look at these things, and I'll read out a sequence of poems which I wrote when I was in that gap year, when I was 24. So forgive the poems for their immaturity, but I just want, these are some of the poems about St. Cyril Road were published, but this is unpublished until now. Should I read this out? Is it okay? So it's a sequence it's called St. Cyril Road sequence. So this is a response to that area from that 24-year-old man who's then beginning to write about his uncle's house in a kind of novel called A Stranger in Sublime Interest. First poem in the sequence is called Midday. The incantatory beating of a hammer against a rock, and two birds cleave the field of air. The sun sits in the garden while the gardener cuts and piles up grass and leaves the flowers secure, untouched. A woman sweeps the courtyard, unsettling bedded in permanent blankets of dust and silence, and I'm lulled by the sound of workmen delving the road. Their cloudy metal clanging apotheosizes rest like a recurrent Chinese gong. I can't see them. I think of their silhouettes flashing in the heat, bodies bent like ciphers. Each sound lacks permanence, each wakeful image in its sharp flowering and fading to a zero in this white, sun-white moon is a constant loss of itself, and then a recovery, a glowing echo surfacing from a dark sentinel's well. Twice with my sense-heavy eyes I notice, along a muffled world of toy-like objects, the tangent outline of a dragonfly against a leaf, its wings whirring so fast you can hardly see them unless you imagine their balance between urgency and composure. Catch one and not a thread around its end, and you can fly it like a kite. let it go, and it will glide off, diminishing with mournful elegance, the thread lagging behind it like a vapor trail, spuming from a low jet, ribboning the sky. Meanwhile, I fall asleep. Like a film of dust that's absorbed the 7 colors, quietly, the dragonfly, the cut grass, the echoing workman, and a reticence settle imperceptibly on my black pupils. These are twice born in my sleep. When I wake, the lonely road crumbles before my eyes. So that's the first section. Second section is called Evening. Just checking out here. The 5 evening. But beyond this lintel slender lane, surprising as a sliver of sunlight between curtains, faint as a yellow root of light no one dare tread on, are the larger roads that course like dark honey out of a honeycomb towards traffic lights, wheeling intersections, and all is a carnival. Like, I'm reading this as if I'm reading something out of a parchment, but it's about, remember St. Cyril wrote is also early 80s, Bombay is moving towards economic deregulation. So these larger roads are already changing. At sunset, they say it's the peak hour, and the cars swim like red or silver fish past the junctions, and the lights shudder on in shops, recreating golden afternoon. But in this lane, the light of the sun goes out, and little islands of fluorescence shine in the rooms behind windows, and pigeons stop quarreling and mating, or mating and quarreling, and a mathematical progression of birds and insects dissolve into their imprecise, unlit shadows. What elsewhere, everywhere, in the hot crucible of the city is the peak hour, is here the casual, trickling moment of gradual anticlimax, the leveling of shadows into shadow, the moment when the old Parsi lady interrupts the impractical river of talk from her unmarried brother-in-law and says, "You must stay for dinner, you mustn't leave without dinner." And there is a pause in the conversation of the world. Now, Sunday. Morning, and the mist ripples back to the unexpected roofs like a flock of endless white gulls circling to rest. And a galaxy of dew and insect glistens as trees arrive silently out of the moist darkness, and this slow flowering steam wavers from my coffee cup. Then the single bread of peace is broken and distributed this Sunday. Peace broken into pieces, and the fine, too delicate crumbs rain on the earth, where the earth opens like a grateful palm. Never to have lived is best. And the second best is to grow old with the morning into afternoon, and then to evening, when sundry shadows and gestures marry like the vanished divisions of a shut fan. This Sunday-rackness, this biblical quietude, unlaboring in waves, the crows pre-arranged on the boughs, the leaves a parrot green, and the flies relearning a disciplined dance. No movement but this dance, no movement but a mimicry of shadows, and no voice to be heard but the newspapers, as it crackles peremptorily in an old man's tangled fingers. I think this is the old man opposite, who I keep returning to, the man in the opposite house. Community, this is the poem we were talking about. This is the second last, number 4. In the oldest bunched houses with tottering stairs, the Christians live like prophets dedicated to the cause of being obscure. The men with guitars, the old women knitting. All their lives they've waited. Here, lining the lane at systematic intervals, the bruised bungalows squat with the wild beard of grass in the gardens, and watered down 20-watt bulbs shine in the verandas. Around them, a mass of tall, colored buildings rise as each timid bungalow is emptied, and Christians who lived behind those doors generations together, now old as weed, sell their land and property for drink. Their houses come down on all fours. In their place, the large buildings burgeon with neat rectangular gardens. I myself live in one. But occasionally I scan the lettering on those gates. Helen Villa, Rose Cottage, ironically dark in the sun. And here's the last one in this sequence. After midnight. Last night, the medallion moon was caught oddly between sleek, glowing channels of telegraph wire. No one stirred, but a pacific of lights went on burning in the vacant porches, the garages. I imagined an impassioned movement beneath the still surface, as if ants were traveling by hidden routes under the sleeping earth, or a fin was dipping again, past the calm skin of water. Twice I sensed hands behind windows strike a match, and a swift badge of flame open and shut like a hot mouth. Later ghosts of dead Christians, dead animals, return to displace a leaf, to push a gate and to knock on the silence of the living. A worried wind scuttled past the schoolyard, shadows slept on gaping church benches. Meanwhile, the stars blinked, small valedictory beads of moisture on a surface of melting glass. Then the watchman sojourned through the lane, tapping the walls and the lampposts with a stick straight and mutely resonant, startling, no doubt, frogs and bandicoots in their homely undergrowth by the gutter. Around him, the heavy trees bent their necks, swans at the edge of a dark lake. I stood and listened to the slow and solitary rhythm of his stick, as it spoke and spoke again, then again. Each brief pellet of sound, insufficient but accurate, as a metronome keeping time while a reluctant child practices scales. Eloquently it faded, dim, repetitive, metallic. Tick, 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 tick. In the purblind darkness, then nothing. Only the faint circular ticking of my wristwatch, where the white radium-pointed arms on the grey dial changed from minute to minute, conceiving morning. So even then I suffered from insomnia, and I used to spend late nights looking out from the balcony. And I see it now that some of the things I was talking about to do with living and not living, and also something that I borrow from the Greeks and quote here, never to have lived is best. And the second best, that I didn't quote, is to die early. So that never to have lived is best, and connected to that, and the other thing is to embrace existence. So replace the die early bit with, and the second best, not the second, actually the best thing is to embrace existence. But I'm slipping that in, never to have lived is best. So this is a moment, I think, of change in my life, which will then lead to the sort of work I do, the kind of novels that I write. I'm sorry I read out 5 of these, but there you are.
Maybe read a few poems from your new collection. Maybe we could just begin with Sweet Shop and then talk about
Yeah, so because you're getting a surfeit of poetry and poetry readings, I'll preface this then, what she's calling the new collection. Actually, there are 2 new collections put into this. So this is called Sweet Shop. The publisher wanted to, usually it would be just called New and Selected Poems. But, he thought Sweet Shop is a nice name. It's going to attract, millions of readers, once it has that title. So Sweet Shop is the name actually of a book that I wrote, which came out maybe in 2018. And that was my return to poetry after a very long time. I wrote those poems very quickly. And I'll tell you what happened. So I kind of ended up writing a lot of prose and passing it off as novels and fiction and stuff like that. And I began to sort of write essays, and I began to explore those things, and I began to write less poetry over the years. Sweet Shop happened because I had this crazy idea of doing an art experiment. So I thought about this kind of experiment for about 7 years. Yeah, I thought about it for 7 years, and I thought, again I thought it was like that. Don't put this in the bio, don't put that in the bio. I thought people are going to say, this guy, what the hell does he think he is? Who does he think he is? Now he's doing an art experiment. First year novelist, then he writes poetry, he writes essays, criticism, or whatever. I can't remember what I said. So it's all that music, Hindustani, and then he went into this kind of stuff. No, this is not fusion. Now he wants to do art. Who is this guy, and what does he think he is? So 7 years I kind of thought about it. Should I do this? Shouldn't I do this? What will happen if I do it? And I thought, okay, let me go ahead with it. So, so the going ahead involved. So let me tell you about the ideas for the art exhibition. The art exhibition would have 3 components. One would be the portraits of sweet shop owners. So now I have noticed this, that in Calcutta now, the sweet shop, Mishti Dokan, is a place of, many of those sweet shops have holes in the wall and they remain unchanged. Some of them have had, slightly tacky makeovers, but mainly they remain grimy, and some of them are quite grimy and unapologetic and very famous as well. Like Mrityunjay comes to mind. I hope the fact that this is being recorded doesn't make me, and I won't be guilty of it saying anything libelous. But I'm saying Mrityunjay is great, but it is a hole in the wall, I think. So many of them have the pictures of the portraits of the sweet shop founders on the walls. So when I would see these portraits, I would think to myself, these look like great men. These look like amazing men, and they look no different from the great poets and writers and historians and scientists of the so-called Bengal Renaissance. So I said, what is it that is giving people of that generation that kind of secular mystery? It's not as if they are religious figures or priests, but they have this kind of air of authority and mystery as they're emerging into this new age. And I couldn't get my head around it, but I was very taken with these sweet shop owners, and I thought I would take pictures of these portraits. That would be part 1 of my exhibition. The second part was going to be, gifts that I'd been getting over the years and hadn't been able to use. They were just lying there, and they're of no use to me. So I thought, I would have an exhibition of 8 of those gifts. That section would be called unusable gifts. So it was like when I sang in Salt Lake a long time ago, they gave me a kind of 4 Tiffany lamp. Brought it home, and if you touch it, was sensor lamp. You touch it and it would switch on. So I remember saying to my wife and my mother, who were on the verge of getting rid of it, what are we going to do with this? Keep it, because I put it in an exhibition of unusable gifts. So that is when that section of unusable gifts to have the exhibition. The final one was called Indian road signs, where I'd seen these Indian road signs which not only had names of roads and places, but also things like cleanliness is next to godliness, haste makes waste, and stuff like that. So then I would put in my own stuff, and this stuff was coming to me, the French of Mallarmé saying to Degas, you do it with words. Like Degas said to Mallarmé, I have such wonderful ideas for poems, Mallarmé. Mallarmé said, you don't write poems with ideas, you do it with words. So I thought I'll put that in one of the signs. Then there was Holderlin, full of merit but poetically man dwells on this earth. And then John McEnroe, you cannot be serious. And then Taka Mati Mati Taka, this is Ramakrishna Paramahansa. I put all of those into the signs. So that was part 3. Now to do part 1, I had to go to all these places, and especially North Calcutta. So I went to all these older sweet shops like Nopur, Bhimnag I already knew. And Bhimnag has multiple portraits, like the founder's younger brother, founder's the second sort of whatever. Anyway, so there are many portraits of people with like grandiose personalities. I took these pictures. As I took these pictures, I began to want to write poems about those sweets, the sweets. They seemed like a cosmology to me. So that's how it began. So I'm reading 3. Right? 3 is a good number. So I read 3. First one is called Sweet Shop. It's the eponymous, the title poem. In fact, this is the first poem I wrote after returning home from that first excursion. Sweet Shop. The whole universe is here. Every color, a few on the verge of being barely tolerable. Every shape as well as minute flourishes created in the prehistory of each shondish by precise pinches. The horizontal trays brim but don't tremble with mass and form. The serrations are near invisible. You'd miss them if they were deeper or clearer. The soft oblongs and the minuscule hard pillow-shaped ones are generated so neatly that instinct alone could have given them shape and no mold. In the harmony shielded by the glass is an unnoticed balance of gravity and play. I'll read a poem called Shamalda, which is actually about a cousin of mine. I'll call it Shamalda. Shamalda. Shamalda, you had possibly travelled over 1,000 miles when once, on our way to Rishra, pierced by hunger, you chose to stop the car and alight for a sweet. Hunger impelled you to those windows behind which, around hard shondish and the ooze of chomchom and the yellow puddle of rabri, a haze of insects were hovering or swimming or climbing as on an island without a human being. The ants, though touched by the mishti's resin, had laboriously freed themselves to ascend slopes. The flies, enlarged by these environs, banged into each other. I asked you how you brought yourself to eat a specimen from that tray. What if there's something on it? And you laughed like a girl and invoked the Bengali imperative of hunger. Evidently more immediate than sorrow. I would flick it off and eat. You waved away in a gesture the invisible living creature as if dismissing some stupid universal decorum. And the third one from the Sweet Shop select collection that I'm going to read out is Bhimnak. I just mentioned Bhimnak, North Calcutta, Bhimnak. Not that deep into the north, but it feels the world's transformed, the twin poles of the handcart, immovable, pointedly thwarting buses, robust men unfocused yet engrossed in everything but the lax neighborly goals. Unlike the desultory south, the road has no angles and is interminable, culvert-like. It and the drifting buildings make the journey north echo that trip to Venice. The rubbish floats on a current. Just here, processions from College Square will veer toward the unobtrusive fork at Nirmal Chandra Street and make their way to Esplanade, intermittently protesting a malignant dispensation. Here is Bhimnak. Before reaching it, I tasted its doi. A pink so shadowy, it feels the colors all but drained away. I pick up a pot. It's the same. So uncannily sweet, so close to liquid, you swallow it as it lies on your tongue. Nothing of the outside is here. Legends hang on walls. The interior has, despite its abundance, the quiet of Ramakrishna's room in Dakshineshwar. On one half of white shondish, rose petals rest with funereal simplicity.
I'd like to return to the first line of the Sweet Shop poem. In fact, which is in fact the first line of this collection. It is the whole universe is here. It seems like a very simple line, but the syntax coming at the start and then whatever follows, not just this poem but the poems that you read and the poems in this book, I think it's pointing to a particular tradition to say that the whole universe is here, and that this is being said about a sweet shop is pointing towards a tradition where you can experience the world inside your mouth. You have written about this yourself. For many of my students who've taken the Rasa theory course with me, Bhattanayak, for instance, saying that you can experience the world inside your mouth. I'd like you to speak about this, but also link it with something that I think you've been doing for the last 3 decades of your writing and publishing career, which is to give us an alternative history of the Indian modernity. You teach a course on modern Indian literature, you have edited the Picaro Book of Modern Indian Literature, and have written numerous essays on the subject. So to begin with this, the whole universe is here through Bhattanayak, and why do you want us, and including yourself as a writer, to think of this alternative tradition of Indian modernity that has not been given to us?
But I think we are running out of time. That's not really.
It's 14:20.
Oh, 14:20. So we have 2 minutes. No. 12
Is it okay
minutes.
we continue to 40? If you want to read other poems, that's okay.
What should I do? Should I answer the question? I mean, or should I read more poems? Answer the question. Huh? Both. Let me see if it's possible to answer the question in brief. It's not. Can you help me out? Can you just, can you say what you have in mind a little bit more?
You've written about Bhattanayak in your essay, right? This tradition of Indian modernity that you are giving to us, which is very different from an idea of European or Western.
I don't want to necessarily sort of, I mean, talk about modernity and modernism. But I'll try and sort of do some justice to the trouble you've taken to formulate this question by thinking of something.
Or maybe we open this to the for Q&A.
But let me just say that modernism for me is a particular. Now I see it as a critique of the Enlightenment. I mean, I see. So that people do make this kind of conflation between. Also, they make enough of a distinction as well between modernity and modernism. And so I'll give you sort of 2 maybe sort of lay ideas of what modernity and modernism might mean. And the lay idea of modernity is it is progress. So I am modern. To say I am modern means that I am not backward, right? And I have all the kind of sort of, I can access all the accoutrements that accompany modernity and are signs of modernity, which include this room with its air conditioning and fans and electric lights. We identify such a setting with modernity. We also identify the individual with modernity, the emergence of the rational thinking individual. So we're talking about the Enlightenment as well. As modernity being a project that emerges with the Enlightenment. And then we have modernism, which again in a lay sort of account, but a very pervasive one, is because the language of modernism, if you know it, is disjunctive, broken up and fragmentary. this lay account, which is also very pervasive, it's lay, but it also goes up right to the mandarins of modernism, is that it is an allegory of breakdown. Modernism is an allegory of civilizational breakdown. The breakdown of the unitary past, of the Western unitary past, of Europeans, the Europeans' unitary past. This is how we used to read The Wasteland as students. All that light, these fragments have assured against my ruins. So, for me, modernism is a disjunctive and liberated language. It is a joyous and buoyant language. It is not an allegory. It is not an allegorical language. It cannot be reduced to an account of a civilizational breakdown. It emerges for me from, not just emerges, it surfaces over history at different points, always as a critique of the unitary, not as an allegory of the breakdown of the unitary, but as a critique of the unitary. So modernism is, for me, any movement that is tired of the dead end of the unitary, of the integrated self, and of the representation. I would also say that, at least in the last 300 years or 400 years with the Renaissance, I mean, we are also living in a period of the representational, where we think that here I am, that's reality, and my job is to know reality and to speak about my relationship with reality, further than my relationship, to talk about what I know of reality, and knowledge is connected to mastery, the mastery of what is around me. And one of the roots of mastery is representation, the representation. That I can take a photograph of it, or if I can't take a photograph, then what is closest to a photograph? In 1800, it's a painting. And the great thing for this account of modernity would be that a certain kind of painting emerges in Europe, which completely approximates what we think is the primary function of the photograph, that is to reproduce three-dimensional perspectival reality. And for the language critiques representation, critiques this idea of reality, critiques this idea of the self's relationship to reality, this is a dead end. And that language must break out of it. And one such language is modernism. And modernism is happening because of this kind of situatedness of the West and of all emerging so-called rational middle class sort of constituencies across the world through colonization or whatever other historical movements that are going on, situatedness in a new circulation of these old non-representational texts and non-representational traditions. Non-representational texts and non-representational traditions and their iconography are beginning to circulate from the late 18th century onwards. It's this huge period of this circulation, and everybody is awestruck by what is coming from there, because it creates a way out from this representational, beautiful kind of path of enlightenment knowledge and its suffocation. It allows for this extraordinarily buoyant language which is fragmented, disjunctive and joyous. This is why I see the language of modernism as being a joyous language, as being a language that's animated by the fact that it's liberating itself from the dead end of the Enlightenment. And in this, all these people that you've been talking about, Bhattanayak, the circulation of these ideas of rasa, which we have, unfortunately, we the moment you say these words, they have such immensely kind of representational associations that we have to put them in the domain of Indology or the Orient. We cannot see them as intellectual history. However, people like John Cage or Eliot, or all those people who are, I'm not talking about Cage here, but Eliot and others, or Clive Bell, the people who are hanging out with Anand Kumar Swami and are getting some of this kind of material from him and other sources, are reworking previous ideas of realism of the representation and of what the work of art does, and taking it away from saying that the work of art is an account of, it's a portrait of a society, it's a document of a society, or it's an account of the intentions and the psychology of the writer and the emotions of the writer. This is something else is happening that frees it of these paradigms, and that's what I think of as modernism, and that is something I would always be interested in, because I myself find those paradigms of little use, but they're so pervasive that I've had to think my way through them with the help of, it's been as accidental as anything else, this whole journey of readings and making these connections.
I think perhaps in your essay about the Bhagavad Gita, you've called the poetic an interruption. So I think we'll have to interrupt this section now. We have classes.
Yes, the Gita is an interruption in the Mahabharata, and it requires a different kind of reading. It's a moment of stasis. Now think about modernism being accounts of stasis, which are not actually dull. Think about the poem as a form of stasis which you are not reading for information, which is why you can re-enter it the moment you've finished it. You can reread it. You're not rereading it to sort of find out more of the same, but you feel like rereading it. I would say the same with the Gita, that when you've moved to the end, you have not learned anything new, but some kind of shift has taken place. You can re-enter it. It's a very different form of, it asks for a very different form of reading from the Mahabharata or the Bhagavad Puran. It's one of the earliest texts which emerges from and creates an aesthetic of stasis and the meaning of stasis, and therefore asks us to rethink what we do when we're reading. And this is a very influential history of reading, I think. Not the reading of for information, or not even the reading for pleasure, but the reading that entails going nowhere while a shift has taken in meaning has taken place. This is a very interesting lineage, a very important lineage, very, very important.
Questions, maybe? No? Yeah.
There's a poem of yours that I found really fascinating. It's like Ramanujan in the Sweet Shop.
Yeah.
So I had a minor perennial source, like curiosity as well. So whether the Mahesh and the Hiraman, the poem by Dr. Mahesh Rangarajan and Dr. Hiraman Tiwari. Who are you?
Mahesh and Hiraman. Let me read out the poem. It's a short poem. Ramanujan. The title Ramanujan is the mathematician. Yeah, that's right. Let the crowd sort of. And then I'll answer your very searching question, your biographical question. Okay, I'm going to read. Ramanujan. Mahesh would cycle or simply strive to the Broad Street Wimpy's to get himself a bean burger. With a wisdom not expected of a Tamil Brahmin from Delhi, he claimed it would suffice. In Balliol, the alternative was jeweled Brussels sprouts and carrots in remnants of lukewarm water. On good days, the vegetarians, might stumble upon sauerkraut or steaming cauliflower or gratin. You, Hiraman, chose to forage weekly up the Cowley Road for turmeric, rice and chickpeas and potent jars of chana masala powder. In the co-op, you spotted yogurt. It was chickpeas that kept you alive. In hall, you scrutinized the mash. Poor Ramanujan. 70 years before you, he must have been the first meat-abhorring Hindu to conjure up from odds and ends. No spices then in Oxbridge, no curry leaves, hardly anything even for the ordinary Englishman in a time of conflict and rationing. A semblance at odd hours of night and day of an aroma that half pacified the voice that asked, "Why are you here?" Okay, so Mahesh Rangarajan, yes, it's Mahesh Rangarajan, because he was the guy who used to go and eat those bean burgers. I discovered bean burgers and that, that certain people thought they were edible from him. And Hiraman Tiwari, yes, it is the same Hiraman Tiwari, Sanskritist and scholar, and at that time forager for chickpeas. These are all vegetarians who were dealing with the conundrum of being at Oxford. It's interesting how some of these people, the directions in which they've gone, one, towards kind of liberal establishment, other towards a different kind of establishment. It's fascinating. It's fascinating for me.
I had a question about Sweet Shop because you were writing about something so fascinating to you because of how sweet shops are just holes in the walls. And yet, when you said the universe is here, the sensation I got was of the archetypical third place from home and work where everyone gathers. And that's really what the Mishti Dukan has always been, whether it's a hole in the, but it's only ever the holes in the walls, never the big glitzy shops with the glass fronted windows. It's always the holes in the walls where people gather for another cup of tea and maybe a mishti and some chat. What are some of the other third places that you feel possess that sort of noof, if you will?
You're right, it is such a place. I mean, a place of fleeting congregation. There is a poem over here called Tapas or Tapas about this. Because also I did encounter such spaces in Spain where people used to go in for tapas and only stay there for like 10 minutes and then move to another place by the way for tapas. And they were also quite, shabby places, but interesting. So that's another example. What are other such places? I don't know. I mean, my mind's going blank now. But I suppose these places are of interest because they are neither home nor the outside. And and this is how, of course, and we frustratingly go back to Benjamin, the arcade, because he's one of the first people to, and Baudelaire, among the first people to sort of articulate this kind of area in the city which is neither home nor an exterior. Adda, people behaving like a part of the street is their drawing room. This is what, I think this is what Hannah Arendt says about Flannery and Benjamin, and says that there was so much pollution in the city that it always seemed like the sky had a layer of some gaseous covering on it, and this made Paris feel like an interior a lot of the time. So she says you could wander about the street as if it were your drawing room, because of this sense of it being an interior. And Adda also makes that assumption. And there are many writers for whom this is important. And for instance, Naipaul says this about Trinidad, that so much of the because the weather is warm, so much of people's lives are led outdoors. And then he describes a scene at a bus stop where people are waiting for a bus. And so what you get to see are a great deal of the unconscious kind of expressions and rhythms in a person's life. which you wouldn't in the West. You know, what a person, a stranger is looking like when they are bored or in a state of mild anticipation. Because also in England there are strict rules about looking at other people. You pretend not to see them. You look at a reflection, you not look at them. You suddenly look in the window of the tube and you see that somebody is looking at you, but they are not looking at you in the flesh, as it were. So, whatever the reasons, Naipaul is saying that there is a kind of quality in life in the tropics in Trinidad, which is allowing a degree of study to do with the unconscious rhythms of people's lives. And again, this talks about this space which is exterior on the outside, but it's also like home. That there is a degree of intimacy over there, which allows intimacy. Doesn't mean you go and put your arm around the person. It means that you can be aware of them during certain moments when they themselves are unaware.
I think we'll have to leave other. Soumya, go ahead.
Professor, I was struck especially by this poem Just As, and the last few lines which say, "So Shondesh in its untouchable heterogeneity is displaced behind the pane, as in a museum to be stared at and historicized." And we read about the found aesthetic in our modern Indian literature course, and we were also discussing it in poetry. And I was sort of thinking if this object here, the Shondesh, is almost sort of being transformed into a found object right within this poem. And also in the previous poem, the last line reads, "I did not eat or taste you, but entirely consumed you and your consumers." And this sort of consumption that's happening in both the poems, one where you're not just eating or tasting it, but you entirely consume you and the consumers too. So I was thinking of first what kind of consumption is taking place in both the poems, and also about the found aesthetic, if something's happening around that in that poem.
Right. Well, in Just As, it's the short poem in which I came out of the fact that I began to think that there were so many beautiful things which as a child one wanted to eat. There were erasers, those scented erasers which looked amazing, and I remember feeling very tempted to bite them. And there are cakes of soap also which look very beautiful, and you feel like, of course, a lot of people ate toothpaste. And also some certain cough medicine. It was delectable to children. But there was certain things that were completely inedible which you looked at. And here was I with Shondesh, not eating, but looking at. Now, there were things which I was looking at and wanted to eat. And here was I with Shondesh. The line between them was wavering. As it does between art object and found object, here the line between what can be savored and what is not meant to be savored, what kind of savoring is looking and what kind of savoring is eating, those lines were blurring, which is why I think I wrote the poem. And I wanted to consume you when the poet says in Nokur, meaning I wanted to consume you, the sweet shop, and your customers. So the I is consuming over there. So the word consume, of course, carries with it, certain sort of associations to do with capitalism. But I'm using that, I'm risking that, but also showing that it's possible to use it to talk about, the kind of, that she brought up, Shumana brought up rasa. So this act of savoring, to savor, you look at something and you savor it. You are in a sense tasting it. So this act of you go to this great Shondesh, this great sweet shop called Nokur, you don't actually eat anything there, but you taste the shop, which includes its consumers.
When we spoke about the first line in the poem Sweet Shop, the whole universe is here, there was a line that I found very similar to that one in Green Now. Nothing at the outside is here. I was wondering if you wrote those in relation to each other.
With Bhimnag, it was with the Sweet Shop, the title poem. It was like I saw trays of sweets, which I was not going to touch, of course. And I was just as I was looking at them, I thought, my God, these are quite a display, you know, and it did seem like a cosmology. If you've seen these pictures of cosmologies, you see they have the sun, the moon, the stars, and various galaxies and various hierarchies of existence. And the Sweet Shop, kind of the panels seem to open up into something like that. With Bhimnag, it was just the kind of utterly surprising isolation of the place that it wasn't isolated, or the moment you entered it, it felt unto itself separate, and as if the outside didn't matter. That's why I brought up Ramakrishna's room in Dakshineshwar. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you had the sweets outside as well. No? Then you must now. And thank you for staying on. And if you want, there are copies of the book there. And thank you again, and thank you too for joining us and reading your poems.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I apologize for the price of the books. They are beyond your budget, but